There was a time when the world believed they were watching the birth of a modern fairy tale. Cameras followed every appearance, headlines celebrated every public gesture, and millions of people projected their hopes onto a couple who seemed determined to rewrite the rules of fame, royalty, and celebrity culture all at once. To their supporters, they represented rebellion wrapped in elegance. To their critics, they represented ambition disguised as authenticity. But behind the carefully staged photographs and perfectly rehearsed interviews, another story was unfolding quietly in the shadows. At the center of that story was a woman who understood something most people never fully grasp about modern fame. The public does not buy reality. The public buys narrative. And once a narrative becomes emotionally powerful enough, people stop questioning whether it reflects the truth. They begin defending it as if it were their own memory. Long before global interviews, streaming documentaries, and magazine covers transformed her into an international symbol, she was simply another ambitious performer trying to survive inside an industry built on reinvention. Hollywood is filled with people chasing opportunity, but very few understand how to convert opportunity into mythology. She understood it instinctively. Friends from her early years described someone intensely focused, highly strategic, and deeply aware of image. Conversations were rarely casual. Every social interaction carried purpose. Every connection was evaluated for long-term value. While others around her treated fame like a dream, she treated it like architecture. Every decision became another brick in a future identity she intended to build. The producer she married during those years believed he was supporting a partner through the difficult early stages of an entertainment career. He introduced her to industry circles, defended her during periods of rejection, and remained convinced that success would strengthen their relationship rather than replace it. But people close to them later described an uncomfortable shift once larger opportunities arrived. As her career expanded, her social world changed with it. New circles brought new ambitions. Old relationships slowly disappeared. Friends who once felt essential became distant memories. Phone calls stopped, invitations vanished. Familiar faces were quietly filtered out of her evolving world. Then came the breakup that stunned nearly everyone who knew them. There were no dramatic confrontations, no emotional public scenes, no long explanation attempting to preserve dignity. Instead, the separation unfolded with a cold efficiency that people around them would discuss for years afterward. Personal items reportedly arrived through delivery services instead of conversations. Symbols of commitment were returned without sentiment. What had once been presented as a love story suddenly looked more like a completed transaction. To outside observers, the split became just another Hollywood divorce. The entertainment industry moves quickly, and the public rarely pauses long enough to question deeper motives. But those closest to the situation sensed something more unsettling. The relationship had not simply ended. It had been professionally erased. That distinction mattered, because erasing a relationship is very different from surviving one. Around the same time, a larger transformation was taking place. Public appearances became more polished. Interviews became more calculated. Messaging became increasingly refined. Compassion, empowerment, healing, authenticity, and resilience evolved into recurring themes. Every statement fit neatly into a broader emotional brand that appealed to audiences hungry for inspirational storytelling. The public loved it. In a chaotic media environment filled with outrage and division, the image of a confident, articulate woman standing against powerful institutions became commercially unstoppable. Streaming platforms invested heavily. Publishers pursued exclusive deals. Publicists carefully shaped the narrative into something larger than celebrity culture. It became symbolism. But symbolism can become dangerous when reality refuses to cooperate. Inside elite media circles, whispers slowly began circulating about inconsistencies between the public image and private behavior. Former associates privately questioned timelines, relationships, and carefully edited stories that no longer matched what they remembered. Most stayed silent. Some feared legal consequences. Others simply understood how modern celebrity ecosystems operate. Once a global narrative reaches a certain size, opposing it becomes almost impossible. The machine protects itself. And the machine surrounding the couple was enormous. Public sympathy generated influence. Influence generated contracts. Contracts generated wealth. Wealth generated protection. Soon, criticism itself became part of the brand. Every negative article reinforced the idea that they were victims of larger systems determined to silence them. It was a powerful cycle. The more controversy appeared, the stronger the public identity became. But privately, cracks were beginning to form. The prince, at the center of the story, had entered the relationship believing he was protecting someone from the kind of public cruelty that once devastated his own family. People close to him said he viewed the relationship emotionally rather than strategically. He saw parallels between past tragedies and present conflicts. He believed history was repeating itself, and he became determined not to fail again. That emotional vulnerability would become one of the defining elements of the entire story. Because while the world saw romance, others saw calculation. Friends from his earlier life reportedly worried about how quickly his identity was shifting. Relationships with longtime confidants deteriorated. Family tensions intensified. Professional obligations became sources of frustration instead of purpose. The life he once understood began disappearing beneath constant conflict, media battles, and public performance. Still, the brand kept growing. Streaming interviews drew global attention. Public speeches generated headlines. Every controversy became content. Every emotional moment became marketable. They no longer functioned simply as public figures. They had become an international business built around personal narrative. And businesses require maintenance. That maintenance came in the form of carefully managed messaging, aggressive public relations strategies, legal warnings, selective leaks, and relentless image control. Former friends and employees reportedly learned very quickly that access could disappear the moment loyalty was questioned. The atmosphere surrounding the brand became increasingly controlled. Some insiders described it as exhausting, others described it as frightening. But even the most carefully managed image eventually faces a problem no amount of publicity can fully eliminate: the past. Because the past has a habit of resurfacing precisely when a public image becomes most dependent on hiding it. By the middle of the decade, industry observers began noticing subtle but important changes. Joint appearances became less frequent. Separate projects increased. Messaging that once sounded unified started feeling fragmented. Behind closed doors, advisors quietly debated how to protect the business if the relationship itself became unstable. The fairy tale was no longer operating smoothly, and somewhere far from the cameras, individuals connected to earlier chapters of their lives were beginning to reconsider years of silence. That was the moment the mythology started colliding with memory. Not because journalists suddenly became more aggressive, not because critics suddenly became louder, but because people who once accepted the official story began asking themselves a dangerous question: what if the public narrative was never the real story at all? Chapter 2: The Cost of Reinvention. Reinvention is celebrated in Hollywood almost like a religion. Actors reinvent themselves. Politicians reinvent themselves. Public figures survive scandals by rebranding their identities before audiences lose interest. But there is a difference between evolving naturally and strategically reconstructing an entire life story. The woman at the center of this saga understood that distinction better than most. By the time she entered elite social circles connected to global power, she had already spent years studying how influence actually works. Contrary to public perception, influence is rarely built through talent alone. It is built through emotional positioning. The most successful modern figures understand how to make audiences feel morally connected to them. That was her true talent. She knew how to speak in the language of empathy while simultaneously strengthening her own status. Interviews rarely focused only on events. They focused on emotional framing. She presented herself not merely as successful, but as misunderstood. Not merely ambitious, but oppressed. Every criticism became evidence of persecution. Every disagreement became proof of systemic injustice. It was an extraordinarily effective strategy. Supporters defended her passionately because they felt they were defending larger ideals rather than a celebrity brand. The emotional connection became so powerful that questioning inconsistencies often triggered outrage instead of discussion. Meanwhile, the prince beside her continued drifting further from the world he once knew. People familiar with his earlier life described him as someone increasingly isolated from long-time relationships. The institutions he once trusted became enemies in his mind. Family members became symbols of betrayal. Former friends reportedly struggled to recognize the person he was becoming. The shift did not happen overnight. It happened gradually. That gradual transformation made it even harder for him to recognize what was occurring, because emotional dependency rarely feels dangerous while it is developing. It feels protective. The couple framed nearly every conflict as a battle between truth and cruelty. Public interviews reinforced the idea that they were standing alone against enormous systems designed to destroy them. Audiences responded emotionally because the narrative mirrored classic storytelling structures: heroes under attack, villains hiding behind institutions, courage triumphing over silence. But behind the scenes, former associates quietly questioned how much of the conflict was organic and how much was strategically amplified. Several individuals who once worked near the couple later described environments dominated by emotional volatility and constant image management. Staff turnover became noticeable. Internal disagreements reportedly escalated quickly. Loyalty became increasingly important. Some employees allegedly felt they were working inside a permanent crisis campaign. Every article mattered. Every headline mattered. Every public appearance required careful calibration. The pressure intensified once commercial expectations grew larger. Streaming contracts demanded content. Publishers demanded revelations. Audiences demanded emotional drama. The couple's identity became financially tied to conflict itself. Peace was less profitable than tension. Stability generated fewer headlines than confrontation. That created a dangerous incentive structure. The more dramatic the narrative became, the more valuable the brand appeared. By this point, critics were no longer merely criticizing behavior. They were questioning authenticity itself. Was the public seeing genuine vulnerability? Or were they witnessing a highly sophisticated media strategy built around emotional manipulation? The question became even more explosive as older relationships resurfaced in public conversation. Former friends, associates, and industry insiders started revisiting stories from earlier years. Some described ambitious networking. Others described calculated social climbing. A few painted far darker portraits involving selective loyalty and emotional coldness. None of it fully broke into mainstream consensus, but the whispers grew louder. And whispers become dangerous when they start aligning with visible patterns. At the same time, the prince appeared increasingly exhausted. Public appearances that once seemed energetic now felt strained. Interviews carried undertones of frustration rather than inspiration. Observers noticed growing signs of emotional fatigue. The image of rebellious freedom that initially captivated audiences began evolving into something heavier: isolation, disconnection, regret. Those words started appearing more frequently in commentary surrounding the couple. The irony was impossible to ignore. They had left one institution claiming they wanted privacy and peace, only to build a global media empire entirely dependent on public exposure. Every personal conflict became content, every grievance became branding, and every emotional wound became monetized. Some supporters continued defending them unconditionally. Others began quietly stepping away. Because eventually, even the strongest emotional narratives encounter a problem. Reality creates patterns, and patterns are difficult to explain away forever. By the end of the year, industry analysts began openly discussing whether the couple's joint brand had reached a saturation point. Independent projects increased. Public appearances became more selective. Separate teams reportedly started managing different aspects of their careers. The language surrounding them changed too. Instead of hearing words like historic and transformational, commentators increasingly used terms like sea,